Crimson Inquiry.
The winter of 1895 brought with it a cold so bitter that even the Thames began to freeze along its edges, and the gas lamps of London struggled against the creeping fog that seemed determined to swallow the city whole. It was on such a night 3 days before Christmas that I found myself seated opposite Sherlock Holmes in our familiar quarters at 221B, Baker Street. A fire crackled heartily in the grate, casting dancing shadows upon the walls lined with Holmes' peculiar collections, chemical apparatus, old newspapers, and correspondence pinned with a jackknife. The scent of pipe tobacco mingled with the faint aroma of Mrs. Hudson's mince pies, which she had left upon a tray that remained largely untouched. My companion, Holmes himself, was in one of his contemplative moods, his lean figure draped across his armchair, fingers steepled beneath his sharp chin, gray eyes fixed upon some invisible point beyond the frost-kissed window. He had spoken barely 10 words since breakfast, a silence I had learned to respect during our years of companionship. I occupied myself with the morning edition of the Times, though my attention wandered frequently to the cheerful decorations Mrs. Hudson had insisted upon hanging sprigs of holly and ivy that seemed almost defiant against Holmes' typically austere aesthetic. "You are wondering," Holmes said suddenly, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade, "whether I shall accompany you to your cousin's Christmas dinner, or whether you shall be forced to make excuses on my behalf once again." I lowered my newspaper, long accustomed to such demonstrations, yet never quite immune to their startling accuracy. "How on earth, elementary, Watson? You have glanced at the invitation upon the mantelpiece no fewer than 4 times in the past quarter hour. Each time, your gaze shifts to me with an expression mingling hope and resignation. Furthermore, you have been absently turning your wedding ring, a habit you display when contemplating social obligations that involve explaining my peculiarities to family members." I could not suppress a smile. "You are quite right, of course. Margaret has been most insistent. Then you must go without me. I find Christmas festivities to be an unbearable distraction from more pressing intellectual pursuits." He gestured vaguely toward a stack of monographs on the table beside him. "I am currently engaged in a comprehensive study of tobacco, ash variations found in the East End, fashioning implications for—" His lecture was interrupted by the sharp ring of the doorbell, followed by the sound of urgent voices in the hallway below. Within moments, Mrs. Hudson appeared at our door, her face flushed with excitement. "Mr. Holmes, there's Inspector Lestrade to see you, sir. He says it's most urgent. Something dreadful has happened at Blackwood Manor." Holmes' eyes brightened with that peculiar gleam I had come to recognize, the look of a hunter catching the first scent of prey. "Show him up immediately, Mrs. Hudson." Lestrade appeared moments later, snowflakes still clinging to his dark coat, his ferret-like features drawn with an expression of genuine bewilderment. In all my years observing the Scotland Yard inspector, I had rarely seen him so thoroughly shaken. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he began, removing his bowler hat and clutching it before him like a lifeline. "I apologize for the intrusion at such an hour, but I find myself confronted with a case that defies all rational explanation." "Excellent," Holmes murmured, gesturing toward the basket chair. "The irrational is merely the unexplained, Inspector. Pray, have a seat and omit no detail, however insignificant it may appear." Lestrade settled into the chair, his fingers drumming nervously upon his knee. "It concerns Lord Reginald Ashworth, of Blackwood Manor in Hampstead. He was found dead this morning in his own drawing room, dressed in a Father Christmas costume, surrounded by presents and children's toys." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. "Good heavens! The circumstances are most unusual," Lestrade continued. "Lord Ashworth was hosting his annual Christmas charity event for the orphans of St. Bartholomew's. Every year, he dresses as Father Christmas and distributes gifts to the children. a beloved tradition throughout the borough. Holmes leaned forward, his fingers still steepled. And this year, the tradition proved fatal. Continue. The children had been gathered in the main hall, waiting for Lord Ashworth's grand entrance. When he failed to appear at the appointed hour, his butler, a man named Graves, went to investigate. He found Lord Ashworth slumped in an armchair in the adjacent drawing room, quite dead. The cause of death? Holmes inquired. That's just it, Mr. Holmes. There's not a mark upon him. The local physician suggests poison, but we found no evidence of any toxic substance. No strange odors, no discoloration of the lips, no signs of convulsion. It's as if the man simply stopped living. Holmes' eyes narrowed. The room, was it locked? Indeed it was. Locked from the inside, with the key still in the door. The windows were latched and showed no signs of tampering. The only other entrance is a servant's door, which was bolted from within the drawing room. A locked room mystery, I observed, feeling the familiar excitement of a new case beginning to take hold. There is more, Lestrade said, his voice dropping. When we examined the body, we found a note tucked into the pocket of the Father Christmas costume. It contained only 3 words: "Justice is served." A heavy silence fell upon the room. Holmes rose abruptly and crossed to the window, his tall, thin silhouette framed against the gray morning light. For a long moment he stood motionless, his breath fogging the cold glass. "The guests at this charity event," he said at last, without turning. "Who was present?" Lestrade consulted a small notebook he had withdrawn from his coat. Besides the 37 orphans and their chaperones from St. Bartholomew's, there were approximately 20 adults. Lord Ashworth's household staff, of course the butler Graves, a cook named Mrs. Pemberton, 2 housemaids and a footman. Then there were the invited guests, Lord Ashworth's nephew, Mr. Victor Ashworth, who stands to inherit the estate. Lord Ashworth's personal physician, Dr. Edmund Hawley, a local vicar, Reverend Thomas Whitmore, and several members of the Hampstead Charitable Society. Any family besides the nephew? Lord Ashworth was a widower. His wife passed 7 years ago, and they had no children of their own. The nephew is his only living relative. Holmes turned slowly, and I saw that his expression had transformed. The languor of moments ago had vanished entirely, replaced by an intensity that seemed to electrify the very air around him. "You mentioned that Lord Ashworth failed to appear at the appointed hour. What was that hour precisely, and when was he last seen alive?" Lestrade flipped through his notes. The children were told Father Christmas would appear at precisely 11 o'clock in the morning. According to the butler, Lord Ashworth retired to the drawing room at 10:30 to make his final preparations. The costume was already laid out for him there. And during that 30 minutes, no one entered or left the drawing room? No one, Mr. Holmes. Graves was stationed in the hallway, ensuring the children didn't wander in and spoil the surprise. He swears upon his mother's grave that no one passed him. Holmes snatched his coat from its hook, moving with the sudden energy that always signaled his full engagement with a problem. "Come, Watson. The game is afoot. You'll take the case then?" Lestrade asked, relief washing across his features. A man dressed as Father Christmas, murdered in a locked room, on the eve of a children's charity event, with a cryptic note suggesting vengeance? Holmes smiled a thin, wolfish expression that held no warmth. "Inspector, wild horses could not keep me away." The cab ride to Hampstead was a study in contrasts. Outside, London prepared for Christmas street vendors hawked roasted chestnuts. Carollers gathered on corners, and shop-fronts blazed with festive displays. Inside our hansom, Holmes sat in brooding silence, his keen eyes distant, fingers occasionally tapping in irregular rhythm upon his knee. "You are already forming theories," I observed. "I am cataloging questions, Watson. Theories without data are dangerous indulgences." He glanced at me, one eyebrow raised. Though I confess, certain aspects of this case already strike me as suggestive, such as the locked room, for one. Contrary to popular imagination, truly impossible murders are rare. When a room is locked from within, the explanation typically falls into one of several categories. The victim locked it themselves, not knowing danger was already present. A mechanical device was employed. Or the room was not in fact as secure as believed. And which do you suspect here? I suspect nothing yet. I observe and I question. He fell silent again, his gaze drifting to the snow-covered streets beyond the window. Though I will note that the cryptic message, "Justice is served," implies a motive of revenge. Whoever killed Lord Ashworth, if indeed he was killed and did not simply succumb to natural causes, believed themselves to be righting some previous wrong. Natural causes? But Lestrade said the local physician suggests poison but found no evidence of it. There are substances, Watson, which leave little trace, certain alkaloids, rare botanical extracts. Your medical expertise will prove invaluable in examining the body. Blackwood Manor revealed itself as we crested a snow-laden hill, a grand Georgian structure of gray stone. Its many windows staring out across the winter landscape like hollow eyes. Despite the festive wreaths adorning its entrance, the house emanated an atmosphere of profound gloom. A constable admitted us through the iron gates, and we found Lestrade waiting at the main entrance, stamping his feet against the cold. I've kept everything exactly as we found it. Mr. Holmes, the body has been moved to the winter parlor, but the drawing room remains untouched. Excellent. Take me there first. We passed through a grand entrance hall where the remnants of the morning's aborted celebration still lingered, tables laden with uneaten treats. A towering Christmas tree adorned with glass ornaments and candles, and piles of wrapped presents that would now go undistributed. The silence was oppressive, broken only by our footsteps upon the marble floor. The drawing room lay beyond a heavy oak door, which still bore the key in its lock. Holmes examined this first, crouching to peer at the mechanism with his pocket lens. "The key is original to the lock," he murmured. "No scratches to suggest it was manipulated from outside. And the lock itself shows no signs of picking." He straightened and surveyed the doorframe. Solid oak, well fitted. No gaps through which a string or wire might pass. We entered the room itself, and I confess that even having heard Lestrade's description, I was unprepared for the scene that greeted us. The drawing room was a comfortable space, furnished in the Victorian style with heavy drapes, ornate wallpaper, and furniture that spoke of old money and older tradition. A fire had burned down to cold ashes in the grate. Near the window stood an armchair, and though Lord Ashworth's body had been removed, the impression of his final moments remained vivid. The Father Christmas costume lay draped across a settee, a magnificent creation of red velvet trimmed with white fur, accompanied by a false beard of impressive dimensions, and a sack that had clearly once contained gifts for the children. Holmes moved through the room, like a hound catching a scent, examining everything with meticulous care. He dropped to his hands and knees to study the carpet, held various objects to the light, and sniffed the air with almost comical intensity. "The servants' door," he said, gesturing to a smaller entrance in the far wall. "You said it was bolted?" "Still is," Lestrade confirmed. "We've left it untouched." Holmes crossed to examine it, sliding back the heavy iron bolt to inspect its mechanism. "Well oiled. Used regularly." He opened the door to reveal a narrow corridor. "Where does this lead?" "To the servants' wing. The kitchen is at the far end." Holmes nodded slowly, his eyes sweeping the corridor before returning his attention to the drawing room. He stood for a long moment at the window, examining the latch and the frost-covered glass. "Watson," he said at last, "what do you make of this?" He indicated a small table beside the armchair where Lord Ashworth had died. Upon it sat a half-empty glass of what appeared to be port wine, and a small plate containing the remnants of a mince pie. His final refreshment? I ventured. Evidently. But observe the positioning. Holmes gestured with his long fingers. The glass has been set down carelessly. A ring of wine stains the table surface. The pie has only a single bite taken from it. A man interrupted in his repast. Perhaps he felt the first symptoms of whatever killed him and abandoned his meal. Perhaps. Holmes did not sound convinced. He lifted the wine glass and sniffed its contents, then dipped a finger within and touched it to his tongue. I started forward in alarm. Holmes, if it's poisoned, port wine, nothing more. Excellent vintage, in fact. He set the glass down and turned his attention to the mince pie, examining it with equal care. Mrs. Hudson's would be superior, but this appears unremarkable. Then if not poison in the food or drink, we are getting ahead of ourselves. Holmes clapped his hands together. I wish to examine the body. And then, Watson, we shall speak to everyone who was present in this house when Lord Ashworth died. We followed Lestrade through a series of corridors to the winter parlor, where Lord Ashworth's body had been laid upon a long table and covered with a white sheet. The room was bitterly cold, which had served to preserve the deceased admirably. 2 constables stood guard at the door, their faces pale and uncomfortable in the presence of death. Holmes drew back the sheet without ceremony, revealing the mortal remains of Lord Reginald Ashworth. He had been a man of perhaps 60 years, stout of build, with a florid complexion and silver whiskers that would indeed have suited the role of Father Christmas. His expression in death was one of mild surprise, as though he had been interrupted mid-thought. I stepped forward to conduct my examination, falling into the familiar rhythms of my medical training. Holmes watched with keen interest as I checked the eyes, the mouth, the fingernails, searching for any telltale signs of toxic exposure. The skin showed no discoloration. The pupils were equal and unremarkable. There was no foam about the lips, no indication of convulsion or struggle. Curious, I murmured, pressing my fingers to the deceased's neck. There is slight bruising here, barely visible. It could be nothing, perhaps, from the costume's collar, but the pattern is unusual. Holmes leaned closer, his gray eyes narrowing. Show me. I indicated the faint marks, 2 small areas of discoloration just below the jaw, almost hidden by the natural folds of the man's neck. They were so subtle that in different lighting, I might have missed them entirely. Pressure applied here would affect the carotid arteries, I explained. Sufficient force, maintained for mere seconds, could render a man unconscious. But to cause death without more obvious trauma, I shook my head. It seems unlikely. Unlikely, but not impossible, Holmes said softly. He produced his pocket lens and examined the marks with extraordinary care, his breath fogging in the cold air. Watson, in your experience, could a man be killed through pressure to these points without leaving more substantial evidence? In theory, yes. There are documented cases of death resulting from vagal inhibition, a sudden shock to the nervous system that stops the heart. But it would require precise knowledge of anatomy and considerable skill. Medical knowledge, perhaps? The implication hung in the air between us. I recalled Lestrade's mention of Lord Ashworth's personal physician among the guests. Holmes straightened, his expression unreadable, and drew the sheet back over the body with surprising gentleness. We must speak with the household, he declared, beginning with the butler who claims no one passed him in that corridor. I find such absolute certainty to be either remarkably convenient or remarkably foolish. We found Graves in the servants' hall, seated at a worn wooden table with a cup of tea growing cold before him. He was a tall man of perhaps 50 years, with the rigid posture and impassive countenance one expects of a butler in service to the aristocracy. Yet beneath that practiced composure, I detected a tremor in his hands and a redness about his eyes that spoke of genuine distress. He rose as we entered, inclining his head with automatic deference. "Gentlemen, I have been expecting you." Holmes wasted no time on pleasantries. You were stationed in the corridor outside the drawing room from 10:30 until the body was discovered. Is that correct? It is, sir. And during that time you saw no one enter or leave through the main door? No one, sir. I would stake my life upon it. Graves' voice was steady, but his fingers twisted together before him. I have served Lord Ashworth for 23 years. The thought that harm could come to him while I stood mere feet away. He faltered, composing himself with visible effort. The servant's door, Holmes continued, his tone neither sympathetic nor accusatory. You said it was bolted from within. When did you last see it unbolted? A flicker of uncertainty crossed the butler's face. I cannot say precisely, sir. The drawing room was prepared that morning by Mary, one of the housemaids. She would have used the servants' corridor. At what time? Before 9 o'clock, I believe. She laid the fire and arranged the costume as Lord Ashworth had instructed. Holmes began to pace slowly, his hands clasped behind his back. And between 9 o'clock and 10:30, who had access to that room? Graves considered the question carefully. The family and guests were gathered in the main hall for refreshments. Lord Ashworth remained in his study until 10:30, when he proceeded to the drawing room to dress. I escorted him myself and took up my position in the corridor. Did he seem troubled? Anxious about anything? Not at all, sir. He was in excellent spirits. The Christmas charity was always his favorite occasion of the year. The butler's voice cracked slightly. He loved those children as if they were his own. I noted Holmes' eyes narrow almost imperceptibly at this statement. He stopped pacing and fixed Graves with a penetrating stare. The note found in his pocket, justice is served. Had Lord Ashworth any enemies that you were aware of? Anyone who might believe themselves wronged by him? Graves hesitated, and in that brief pause, I sensed something unspoken passing behind his eyes. Lord Ashworth was a good man, sir. Generous and kind, but... He stopped, seeming to wrestle with himself. But... Holmes prompted, his voice sharpening. There was a matter some years ago. Before my time in clear memory. I only heard whispers among the older staff. Graves lowered his voice. Something concerning his late wife's death. Rumors that were never substantiated. Holmes leaned forward with the intensity of a hawk spotting prey. Rumors of what nature precisely? Graves shifted uncomfortably, clearly regretting having spoken at all. I should not have mentioned it, sir. It is not my place to spread idle gossip about the family. A man is dead, Holmes said coldly. Murdered in a manner designed to humiliate him before the very children he sought to bring joy. Whatever scruples you possess about household discretion, I suggest you abandon them immediately. The butler's resolve crumbled beneath that withering gaze. Lady Ashworth died 7 years ago. The official verdict was a tragic accident. She fell from the balcony of her bedchamber. But there were those who whispered that the marriage had not been a happy one. That Lord Ashworth had been neglectful of his wife's affections. Neglectful how? There was talk of another woman. A younger woman from the village. Nothing was ever proven, but Lady Ashworth had become increasingly melancholic in the months before her death. Graves paused, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Some said she did not fall. Some said she jumped. And a very few suggested she was pushed. I felt a chill settle over me that had nothing to do with the winter cold. Holmes, however, remained utterly composed, absorbing this information as one might receive a weather report. Who spoke of pushing? I could not say with certainty, sir. The whispers died quickly after her death. Lord Ashworth was a powerful man in the community. No one wished to make accusations without proof. And this younger woman, what became of her? Graves shook his head slowly. She left the village shortly after Lady Ashworth's death. I never knew her name, but... He hesitated again, clearly warring with himself. "Speak freely," Holmes commanded. "There was a child, sir. Or so the rumors claimed. A child born to this woman, fathered by Lord Ashworth. If such a child existed, they would be grown now. Perhaps 18 or 19 years of age." Holmes turned to me with an expression I knew well, the look of pieces beginning to arrange themselves upon an invisible chessboard. An illegitimate heir, hidden away for years, nursing a grievance against the father who abandoned them and perhaps drove their mother to shame and exile. "You believe this child murdered Lord Ashworth?" I asked. "I believe nothing yet. But I find it remarkably suggestive that a man dies with a note proclaiming justice served, and we discover within minutes that his past contained the seeds of precisely such vengeance." Holmes turned back to Graves. "The nephew, Victor Ashworth, where was he during the time his uncle dressed for his role as Father Christmas?" Graves' expression shifted subtly, and I detected something new in his eyes. It might have been suspicion, or perhaps protective loyalty. "Mr. Victor was in the main hall with the other guests, sir, though I confess I did not have eyes upon him every moment." Holmes thanked Graves for his candor and dismissed him with instructions to remain available for further questioning. As the butler departed, I observed my companion's expression grow thoughtful, his fingers drumming a silent rhythm upon the table. "The nephew bears closer examination," Holmes murmured. "A man who inherits everything has motive enough. But combined with this business about the illegitimate child, we find ourselves navigating treacherous waters indeed." We found Victor Ashworth in the library, standing before the frost-covered windows with a glass of brandy clutched in his hand. He was a young man of perhaps 25, handsome in a sharp, angular fashion, with dark hair swept back from a pale forehead and eyes that held a peculiar brightness. He turned as we entered, and I noticed immediately that his composure seemed almost rehearsed too perfect, too controlled for a man who had just lost his only remaining family. "Mr. Holmes." "Dr. Watson," he said, inclining his head. "I wondered when you would seek me out. The nephew always falls under suspicion in such matters, does he not?" "You speak as one familiar with criminal investigation," Holmes observed, settling into a leather armchair without waiting for an invitation. "I speak as one familiar with penny dreadfuls and sensation novels." Victor's smile did not reach his eyes. "I am not a fool, gentlemen. I know how this appears. My uncle dies mysteriously, and I stand to inherit Blackwood Manor and the entirety of his fortune. The circumstances could hardly be more damning. And yet you seem remarkably untroubled by them," I remarked, finding myself instinctively distrustful of the young man's manner. "Appearances can deceive, Doctor. I am merely attempting to maintain my composure in the face of tragedy." He took a long sip of his brandy. "My uncle was the only family I had remaining. Whatever our differences, I did not wish him dead." Holmes' ears pricked visibly at this admission. "Differences? Of what nature?" Victor hesitated, perhaps realizing he had said more than intended. "Financial matters, primarily. My uncle was generous in many respects, but he kept me on a rather tight allowance. He believed young men should earn their fortunes rather than inherit them idle, a philosophy with which you disagreed. I found it hypocritical, given that he inherited his own wealth from his father." Victor's voice carried an edge of bitterness. "But disagreement hardly constitutes motive for murder." Holmes leaned forward, his gray eyes fixed upon Victor with unsettling intensity. "Where precisely were you between 10:30 and 11 o'clock this morning?" "In the main hall, entertaining the children alongside Reverend Whitmore and Dr. Hawley. There are dozens of witnesses who can attest to my presence. Every moment, without interruption." Something flickered across Victor's face too quickly for me to identify, but not quickly enough to escape Holmes' observation. "I may have stepped away briefly to use the facilities. 5 minutes, perhaps less." "5 minutes," Holmes repeated, his voice deceptively mild. "And during these 5 minutes, did anyone observe your movements?" Victor's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. I did not think to arrange witnesses for a visit to the lavatory. Mr. Holmes, such foresight would have been remarkably suspicious in itself, would it not? Holmes rose from his chair and began to pace slowly before the fireplace, his hands clasped behind his back. Tell me about your relationship with Lady Ashworth, your aunt by marriage. The question clearly caught Victor off guard. His carefully maintained composure slipped momentarily, revealing something raw beneath. My aunt? She died when I was barely 18. What possible relevance could she have to current events? Humor me. Victor drained the remainder of his brandy and set the glass down with excessive care. She was kind to me. More so than my uncle, if I am being honest. When my parents died and I came to live at Blackwood Manor, she treated me as the son she never had. His voice softened with what appeared to be genuine emotion. Her death affected me deeply. You were present at the manor when she died? I was away at Oxford. I received word by telegram. Victor's eyes grew distant. By the time I arrived home, she had already been buried. My uncle insisted upon a swift funeral, said he could not bear prolonged grieving. Holmes stopped pacing and fixed Victor with a penetrating stare. Did you believe the official account of her death? That she fell accidentally from her balcony? A long silence stretched between them. I watched Victor's face cycle through several emotions: surprise, calculation, and finally something resembling bitter resignation. There were whispers, he said at last. Servants' gossip that reached my ears despite my uncle's efforts to suppress it. Tales of his infidelity, of my aunt's despair. He met Holmes' gaze directly. Do I believe she fell accidentally? No, Mr. Holmes, I do not. I believe my uncle drove her to take her own life through his callous disregard for her feelings. And yet you remained under his roof, accepting his hospitality and his allowance. Victor's expression hardened. I had nowhere else to go. And perhaps, he stopped himself abruptly. Perhaps what? Holmes pressed. Nothing. It is of no consequence. But Holmes was not so easily deterred. Perhaps you remained because you hoped to inherit that which your uncle had denied your aunt through his cruelty. Perhaps you viewed your eventual inheritance as a form of justice compensation for the woman who had shown you kindness. Victor's face flushed with anger. You twist my words, sir. I loved my aunt, but I did not murder my uncle. I am not a killer. Holmes regarded him with an expression impossible to read. The note found in your uncle's pocket spoke of justice being served. It strikes me that you have just described a situation in which you might believe justice to be precisely what was required. Victor rose abruptly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. I will not stand here and be accused of murder based upon speculation and circumstance. If you have evidence against me, present it. Otherwise, I must ask you to direct your inquiries elsewhere. Holmes remained utterly unperturbed by this display of temper. I accuse no one, Mr. Ashworth. I merely observe and question. It is the nature of my profession. He paused, tilting his head slightly. One final inquiry before we leave you to your grief. Are you acquainted with any young person, perhaps 18 or 19 years of age, who might have connection to this household? Someone who perhaps arrived recently in the area. The question seemed to genuinely puzzle Victor. I know of no such person. Why do you ask? Idle curiosity, Holmes replied, though I knew him well enough to recognize that nothing about his questions was ever idle. We shall trouble you no further for the present. We departed the library, leaving Victor standing rigidly before the windows, his reflection ghost-like in the frost-covered glass. Once we were safely in the corridor, I turned to Holmes with barely contained frustration. Well, do you believe he did it? I believe he is hiding something, Holmes replied quietly. But murder? The evidence remains insufficient. His alibi, while imperfect, places him among witnesses for the majority of the critical period. 5 minutes is scarcely enough time to access the drawing room, kill a man, and return unnoticed. Unless he had an accomplice. Holmes nodded approvingly. Your instincts sharpen with each case, Watson. The possibility of collaboration had indeed occurred to me. But before we pursue that avenue, I wish to speak with Lord Ashworth's physician. A man with medical knowledge would know precisely how to apply pressure to the carotid arteries. We located Dr. Edmund Hawley in the conservatory. A glass-walled room filled with exotic plants that seemed almost obscenely vibrant against the winter landscape beyond. He was a portly gentleman of middle years, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles and hands that trembled slightly as he tended to a potted orchid. "Terrible business," he said as we approached. "Absolutely terrible. I have been Lord Ashworth's physician for 15 years. Never saw a man in better health for his age." "Which makes his sudden death all the more perplexing," Holmes observed. "You examined the body before the police arrived?" "I did. As his personal physician, it seemed my duty." Dr. Hawley shook his head sadly. "I could find no obvious cause. No signs of poisoning that I recognized. No indication of heart failure or apoplexy. It was as though life simply departed from him." Dr. Watson observed faint bruising on the deceased's neck, Holmes said, watching Hale's reaction carefully. "Consistent with pressure applied to the carotid arteries." The physician's face paled noticeably. "I did not notice such marks. But if what you suggest is true, then we are dealing with someone possessing considerable anatomical knowledge. Someone such as yourself. For instance," Holmes remarked casually, though his eyes never left the physician's face. Dr. Hale's hands ceased their ministrations upon the orchid. For a long moment he stood perfectly still, and I observed a complex series of emotions passing across his features: shock, indignation, and something else I could not quite identify. "You cannot seriously suspect me," he said at last, his voice strained. "Lord Ashworth was my patient, my friend. I have dedicated my entire career to preserving life, not ending it. And yet you possess precisely the knowledge required to end a life in this particular manner. The carotid technique requires expertise that few outside the medical profession would possess, as would any trained physician, including your companion, Dr. Watson." Hawley gestured toward me with a trembling hand. "Shall we suspect him as well?" "Watson lacks motive and opportunity," Holmes replied smoothly. "You, however, were present in the house when Lord Ashworth died. Tell me, where precisely were you between 10:30 and 11 o'clock? Dr. Hawley removed his spectacles and polished them with a handkerchief, a nervous gesture that bought him time to compose his thoughts. "I was in the main hall with the other guests. The children were becoming restless, waiting for Father Christmas to appear. I helped Reverend Whitmore organize games to keep them entertained." "And you did not leave the hall at any point during that period?" The physician hesitated, a pause so brief it might have escaped a less observant man. "I may have stepped out momentarily. Mrs. Pemberton, the cook, complained of a headache. I went to my medical bag to fetch her a powder." "Your medical bag," Holmes repeated. "Where was it located?" "In the entrance hall with my coat." "Which would have required you to pass through the corridor where Graves stood guard outside the drawing room." Dr. Hale's face grew even paler. I suppose it would, yes. But I assure you, I did not enter the drawing room. I merely retrieved the powder and returned to the hall." Holmes began to circle the conservatory slowly, examining the exotic plants with apparent fascination. "You mentioned that Lord Ashworth was in excellent health. Had he any concerns recently? Any troubles weighing upon his mind?" "None that he shared with me." Dr. Hawley replaced his spectacles, his composure gradually returning, though I confess he had been somewhat distracted these past few weeks. "Preoccupied, one might say. Did he speak of the cause?" "He mentioned receiving letters that disturbed him. I did not press for details. Physician-patient confidentiality extends to respecting privacy in all matters." Holmes stopped his pacing abruptly. "Letters? What manner of letters?" I do not know their contents. I only know that after receiving them, Lord Ashworth became withdrawn. He increased the household security and instructed Graves to screen all visitors carefully. Dr. Hale's voice dropped. He seemed almost frightened, Mr. Holmes, as though something from his past had finally caught up with him. Holmes seized upon this revelation with visible intensity. These letters, do you know if they were preserved? Where Lord Ashworth might have kept them? His study, I would presume. He was a meticulous man, kept records of everything. Dr. Holly paused, something shifting in his expression. There is one thing more, Mr. Holmes. I hesitated to mention it, as it seemed insignificant at the time. In my experience, the seemingly insignificant details prove most illuminating. Speak freely. Approximately a fortnight ago, I encountered Lord Ashworth in the village. He was speaking with a young woman I did not recognize, a striking girl with dark hair and pale complexion. Their conversation appeared heated, though I was too distant to overhear the words exchanged. My pulse quickened at this information. Holmes and I exchanged a glance laden with unspoken understanding. The mysterious illegitimate child Graves had mentioned. Could this young woman be connected? Describe her more precisely, Holmes demanded. Her age, her manner of dress, any distinguishing features. Dr. Holly closed his eyes, concentrating. Young, perhaps 18 or 19. She wore clothing of modest quality, respectable but not wealthy. Her most striking feature was her eyes. Even from a distance, I could see they were remarkably light gray or perhaps pale blue. They reminded me of someone, though I could not place the resemblance at the time. And Lord Ashworth's demeanor during this encounter? Agitated. Almost fearful, I would say. When he noticed me approaching, he dismissed the girl abruptly. She departed without a word, though she cast a look back at him that I can only describe as venomous. Holmes remained silent for a long moment, processing this information. I could almost see the machinery of his remarkable mind working behind those gray eyes, fitting pieces together into patterns invisible to the rest of us. One final question. Dr. Holly, you say this young woman's eyes reminded you of someone. Has the connection since occurred to you? The physician's expression shifted, understanding dawning slowly across his features. Now that you mention it, Lady Ashworth had eyes of precisely that shade. Pale gray, almost silver in certain light. It was considered her most beautiful feature. Thank you, Doctor. You have been most helpful. We left Dr. Holly among his exotic plants, his face troubled with the implications of his own observations. Holmes walked swiftly through the corridors, his long strides forcing me to hurry to keep pace. The study, he declared. We must find those letters before anyone else thinks to destroy them. You believe the killer may have already considered this? I believe that if Lord Ashworth was murdered by someone from his past, someone connected to his dead wife or his rumored illegitimate child, then those letters may contain the very evidence we require. Holmes paused before a heavy oak door. And I believe that evidence may be far more damning than anyone in this household would wish us to discover. He tried the handle. The door was locked. Holmes produced a small leather case from his coat pocket, extracting a slender pick with practiced efficiency. Within moments, the lock yielded with a soft click, and we entered Lord Ashworth's private sanctuary. The study was a handsome room lined with bookshelves, and dominated by a massive mahogany desk positioned before tall windows. Papers lay scattered across its surface, and the remnants of a hastily extinguished fire smoldered in the grate. Holmes crossed immediately to the fireplace, crouching to examine the charred fragments. Someone has been here before us, he muttered, carefully extracting a partially burned envelope from the ashes. Recently, within the hour, I would estimate. The envelope was damaged but legible. The return address indicated a boarding house in Whitechapel, and though the letter within had been largely consumed by flames, fragments remained. Holmes pieced them together on the desk with infinite patience while I stood guard at the door. Double quotes, single quotes. Sins of the father. Single quotes. Holmes read aloud. Double quotes, single quotes. Mother died in poverty while you lived in luxury. Never acknowledged. 9. Your forgotten daughter, Eleanor. The illegitimate child, I breathed. She exists. She exists, and she was here this morning. Holmes held up another fragment. This appears to be a response Lord Ashworth was drafting. He writes of wanting to make amends, of establishing a trust fund, of public acknowledgement. He was attempting to right his wrongs, Watson. Then why would she kill him before receiving what she wanted? Holmes did not answer immediately. He stood motionless, his eyes darting across the room, cataloging details invisible to my untrained eye. Suddenly, he strode to a portrait hanging above the fireplace, Lady Ashworth, rendered in oils, her pale gray eyes seeming to follow us accusingly. Watson, observe the signature on this portrait. I approached and examined the corner of the painting. E. Blackwood, the artist. Eleanor Blackwood. The same Christian name as our mysterious correspondent. Holmes' voice carried an edge of excitement. Lady Ashworth commissioned a portrait from a young artist shortly before her death. What if that artist was the very woman her husband had wronged? What if Lady Ashworth discovered her husband's illegitimate daughter and, in her despair, formed a connection with the girl? The implications were staggering. You mean Lady Ashworth knew about Eleanor? I mean Lady Ashworth may have been the one to tell Eleanor the truth about her parentage. And I mean that Lady Ashworth's death, whether suicide or accident, may have been the catalyst that transformed Eleanor's resentment into murderous hatred. A sound from the corridor interrupted our discussion. Holmes raised a finger to his lips and moved silently toward the door. He opened it suddenly, revealing the housemaid Mary. Frozen in the act of reaching for the handle, she was young, no more than 19, with dark hair hastily pinned beneath her cap and eyes of the palest gray I had ever seen. Eyes identical to those in the portrait above the fireplace. Miss Eleanor Blackwood, I presume, Holmes said quietly. Or should I say, Miss Eleanor Ashworth? The girl's composure shattered. She turned to flee, but Holmes caught her wrist with surprising gentleness. Running will only compound your difficulties. I suggest we discuss this matter civilly. You cannot prove anything, she hissed, though her voice trembled with fear. On the contrary, I can prove a great deal. I can prove you obtained employment in this household under a false name approximately 3 months ago. I can prove you sent threatening letters to Lord Ashworth, letters he kept despite the danger they represented, perhaps because he felt he deserved the accusations they contained. And I can prove you were the one who prepared the drawing room this morning, giving you ample opportunity to unbolt and later rebolt the servants' door. Eleanor's resistance crumbled. Tears streamed down her pale cheeks as Holmes guided her into the study and settled her into a chair. I closed the door behind us, my heart heavy with the tragedy unfolding before us. I did not mean to kill him, she whispered. I only wanted him to acknowledge me, to admit what he had done to my mother. Tell us everything, Holmes said, his voice surprisingly gentle. From the beginning. And so she did. Eleanor's mother had been a village girl of 17 when Lord Ashworth seduced her with promises of love and security. When she became pregnant, he cast her aside with a modest sum and instructions never to contact him again. She raised Eleanor alone, working as a seamstress until consumption claimed her life 3 years ago. Before she died, she told me everything, Eleanor continued, her voice hollow. She told me about him, about Lady Ashworth, about the life I should have had. She made me promise to seek justice. And Lady Ashworth? I asked, did you know her? Eleanor nodded slowly. She discovered me when I was 15. She had learned of my existence through intercepted letters and sought me out in secret. She was kind to me, kinder than anyone had ever been. She paid for my education, taught me to paint, treated me as the daughter she never had. And then she died, Holmes said. He killed her. Eleanor's voice hardened with hatred. Perhaps not with his own hands, but his cruelty drove her to despair. She could not bear the shame of his continued infidelities, the knowledge that he had abandoned his own child. She threw herself from that balcony because of him. So you planned your revenge, Holmes continued. You obtained employment here, waited for the perfect opportunity. The Christmas charity was his great public display of virtue. I wanted to expose his hypocrisy, to destroy him at the moment of his greatest self-congratulation. Eleanor laughed bitterly. But I did not plan to kill him. I only wanted to confront him, to force him to acknowledge me before his guests. What happened in the drawing room? Eleanor's hands twisted in her lap. I entered through the servant's door while he was dressing. He was surprised but not afraid. He recognized me immediately. He said he had been expecting me, that he had received my letters and wanted to make amends. And you did not believe him? I believed he was trying to silence me with money, as he had silenced my mother. I became angry. I showed him the locket my mother had given me, a locket containing a miniature portrait of Lady Ashworth, who had loved me more than he ever would. Eleanor's voice broke. He tried to take it from me. We struggled. I pushed him away, and my hands found his throat. You knew precisely where to apply pressure, Holmes observed. Your education included anatomy? Lady Ashworth's physician taught me years ago. He was kind to me during her final illness, showed me medical texts to satisfy my curiosity. I never imagined I would use that knowledge too. She could not finish the sentence. The locked door, I interjected. How did you manage it? After he fell, I panicked. I bolted the servant's door and left through the main entrance, locking it behind me and sliding the key back under the door using a thin piece of card. It took only seconds. Holmes nodded slowly. A simple trick, but effective. And the note? Justice is served. I wrote it weeks ago, intending to leave it for him as a warning. In my panic, I placed it in his pocket almost without thinking. I wanted someone to understand why he had died, what he had done to deserve it. A heavy silence fell upon the room. Eleanor sat with her head bowed, tears falling silently onto her clasped hands. Despite the horror of what she had done, I found myself moved by the tragedy of her circumstances. She was as much a victim as a perpetrator. Holmes walked to the window and stood gazing out at the snow-covered grounds. When he spoke, his voice was thoughtful. You acted in anger, not premeditation. A skilled barrister might argue for manslaughter rather than murder. The provocations you suffered, abandonment, poverty, the loss of both your mother and Lady Ashworth, would generate considerable sympathy from a jury. Eleanor looked up, confusion mingling with desperate hope. You would speak in my defense? I would ensure the full truth is known. Lord Ashworth was not the saint this community believed him to be. His sins do not justify his death, but they provide context for your actions. Holmes turned from the window. However, I cannot conceal your crime. Justice, true justice, not the vengeance you sought, demands accountability. I understand, Eleanor whispered. I have understood since the moment I felt him fall. I became the very thing I hated, someone who destroys lives to satisfy their own desires. I summoned Lestrade, who listened to Eleanor's confession with a mixture of professional satisfaction and personal discomfort. She went with him quietly, her pale gray eyes, Lady Ashworth's eyes, fixed upon some distant point beyond the walls of Blackwood Manor. The cab ride back to Baker Street was subdued. Holmes sat in contemplative silence, his gaunt features illuminated intermittently by the gas lamps we passed. The Christmas decorations that had seemed so cheerful that morning now appeared garish, almost mocking. A tragic case, I observed finally. All murders are tragic, Watson. But this one more than most. Holmes stared out at the falling snow. A man's sins committed decades ago, culminating in his death at the hands of the child he abandoned. There is a terrible symmetry to it. Do you believe she will hang? I believe a competent defense will secure a lesser charge. Eleanor Blackwood is not a hardened criminal. She is a wounded soul who struck out in pain and rage. The court will recognize this, particularly when the full extent of Lord Ashworth's history becomes public. We arrived at Baker Street to find Mrs. Hudson waiting anxiously. She fussed over us as we shed our snow-dampened coats, pressing hot tea into our hands and exclaiming over the lateness of the hour. "Such dreadful business on Christmas week of all times," she tutted. "Will you be wanting supper, gentlemen?" "Thank you, Mrs. Hudson. That would be most welcome." As she departed, Holmes settled into his armchair and reached for his pipe. The fire crackled warmly, casting dancing shadows across the familiar clutter of our rooms. The contrast with the cold tragedy of Blackwood Manor could not have been starker. "You asked earlier whether I would accompany you to your cousin's Christmas dinner," Holmes said unexpectedly. "I did. Though given the circumstances, I would understand if I shall come." Holmes lit his pipe, a thin smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "This case has reminded me that family connections, however complicated, are not to be taken for granted. Your cousin Margaret may find my company trying, but I shall endeavor to be on my best behavior." I stared at him in genuine surprise. "Holmes, I hardly know what to say." "Say nothing. Simply ensure there is adequate tobacco and minimal expectation of carol singing." He drew on his pipe, exhaling a contemplative cloud of smoke. "Besides, I find myself unusually appreciative of warmth and companionship tonight." The cold at Blackwood Manor was not merely physical. I understood his meaning perfectly. We had witnessed the bitter fruit of isolation and abandonment, a family shattered by secrets, lies, and the refusal to acknowledge bonds of blood and responsibility. Lord Ashworth had died not because he was evil, but because he had failed to recognize that actions have consequences extending far beyond their immediate moment. "What do you suppose will become of the manor?" I asked, with both Lord Ashworth and his only acknowledged heir implicated in scandal. "Victor Ashworth remains the legal heir, despite his disagreeable personality. The revelation of Eleanor's existence may complicate matters, but she has no legitimate claim to the estate." Holmes shrugged. "Though I suspect the Ashworth name will never again command the respect it once enjoyed in Hampstead. Secrets once exposed have a way of reshaping reputations permanently. And the children from St. Bartholomew's? They came expecting Christmas joy and received only confusion and disappointment." Holmes was silent for a moment. Then he reached into his coat pocket and produced a small leather purse. "I took the liberty of making arrangements with Reverend Whitmore before we departed. The gifts Lord Ashworth intended to distribute will still reach the children, along with a modest additional contribution. Christmas should not be entirely ruined by adult sins." I regarded my friend with renewed admiration. For all his claims of emotional detachment, Holmes possessed a capacity for compassion that he rarely acknowledged. The cold, calculating machine he presented to the world concealed a heart more sensitive than he would ever admit. "You are a better man than you pretend to be, Holmes." "Nonsense. I merely recognize that allowing children to suffer for crimes they did not commit serves no logical purpose." He waved dismissively, but I caught the faint flush of embarrassment coloring his cheeks. "Now let us speak no more of this maudlin affair. Mrs. Hudson's mince pies await, and I find myself uncharacteristically hungry." We passed the remainder of that evening in comfortable companionship, discussing matters of no particular consequence. The case of the Father Christmas murder would eventually fade into memory, taking its place among the countless mysteries Holmes had solved during our years together. But I never forgot the pale gray eyes of Eleanor Blackwood, nor the lesson her tragedy imparted. The sins of the past do not remain buried forever. They grow in darkness, nurtured by resentment and pain. until they burst forth with devastating consequences. Lord Reginald Ashworth had played Father Christmas for the final time, and in doing so, had been forced to confront the child he had spent a lifetime denying. Justice, as Eleanor had written, was indeed served, though not in the manner any of us might have wished as for Holmes. He kept his promise and accompanied me to Margaret's Christmas dinner, where he astonished everyone by remaining civil throughout the entire meal and even complimenting the goose. It was perhaps his way of acknowledging that the bonds between people, however imperfect, are ultimately what give meaning to our brief existence. The winter of 1895 eventually released its grip upon London, and spring brought new cases, new mysteries, new puzzles to occupy that remarkable mind. But whenever Christmas approached in subsequent years, I would notice Holmes growing contemplative, his gray eyes distant with memory. He never spoke of Eleanor Blackwood again, but I knew he thought of her, the forgotten daughter who had sought justice and found only more tragedy. In the great catalogue of human folly that Holmes had witnessed throughout his extraordinary career, her story occupied a unique and melancholy place. Some mysteries, after all, have no satisfying resolution. Some wounds never fully heal. And some ghosts, like the ghost of Lady Ashworth, whose pale gray eyes lived on in the daughter she had loved, continue to haunt us long after the case is officially closed. The E&D thus concludes the singular affair of the Father Christmas murder, as recorded by John H. Watson, M.D., in the winter of 1895.